Good afternoon and welcome to UC Irvine Law School. We're very happy that you joined us. I'm Henry Weinstein. I'm a member of the faculty here, and it is my pleasure to have the opportunity to be in conversation today with my longtime colleague and even longer time friend, Rick Hasen, who is an expert on voting rights, democracy, and a number of other issues. I can say I first met Rick in depth in the days after the Bush versus Gore election, where we were talking virtually every day during a 6 week period of fierce litigation. Rick is going to talk about his fifth book today. He's written books about voting rights, about threats to democracy, and now he's writing about a particularly large problem. The book is called Cheap Speech: How Disinformation Poisons Our Politics and How to Cure It. And when I was reading Rick's book, I was very struck by something that I had read last year by a tiny little book last year that probably had more impact on me than any other book that I read last year. And it's a book called On Tyranny by Timothy Snyder, a distinguished Yale University historian. And I just want to read one of Timothy Snyder's, I'll call him one of his maxims, which is very relevant to today's discussion. Timothy Snyder said, "Believe in truth. To abandon facts is to abandon freedom. If nothing is true, then no one can criticize power because there is no basis upon which to do so. If nothing is true, then all is spectacle. The biggest wallet pays for the most blinding lights." So Rick, let's just get into it. First, I think it would be great if you would just give us all a working definition of what you consider to be, what is cheap speech?
Well, thanks, Henry. And when you said we talked for the 6 months after Bush versus Gore after the 2000 election, it sure felt like 6 months. And the last 2 years have felt like, a decade.
Absolutely.
But I want to take a minute before we go on and just thank you. This is, I think, our fourth book talk together. I have valued you so much as a colleague and as a friend. You are, and this comes from your background as an LA Times journalist for many years. You are one of the best questioners that I encounter because you read deeply and you think about things beyond the immediate and towards kind of long-term concerns about our country. And so I just so appreciate you, and I want to take a minute and say that.
Thank you very kindly. It really is my honor to do this.
So the title of the book is Cheap Speech, and the term is not mine. The term comes from actually a law school classmate of mine who's a professor at UCLA named Eugene Volokh. He wrote an article called Cheap Speech and What It Will Do. It appeared in a 1995 symposium issue of the Yale Law Journal. And it was very prescient in a lot of ways. He predicted the rise of things like Netflix and Spotify and talked about how we would be going from scarcity of speech, by which he meant there are only a limited number of television stations. There were a few national newspapers. Every town had one or two local newspapers. If you didn't like something in those newspapers, you didn't like something in the LA Times, you could write a letter to the LA Times and letter to the editor, and one of 1,000 maybe got published. Otherwise, there was really nothing to do, and we would move from that to what he saw would be, just a vast amount of speech. And today, of course, we literally have the knowledge of the world in the palm of our hands through our smartphones, and can get information and can post any thought we have. Anyone can open a free, as long as you're willing to give up your data, free Twitter account or Facebook account or any other way of communicating. And this, he saw, would lead to a decline in the importance of intermediaries. So it was no longer what the editor of the LA Times thought was important. It could be what anyone thought was important. And he was very optimistic. He asked, how will our democracy function with these, with the demise of intermediaries? And he thought pretty well. And I see that, at least when it comes to American democracy, the rise of cheap speech has been much more of a mixed bag. And I'm concerned specifically with speech about elections and speech that helps voters make decisions. And so I mean cheap speech in a dual sense of the word. One sense is the one that Volokh used, the idea of inexpensive speech, very easy to disseminate. But I also looked at the darker side, which is we have a system now where lower valued speech is more available. And so think about what's happened to, and Henry, you know this better than just about anyone, what's happened to newspapers. The economic model for newspapers on the local level has collapsed, right? You have a few super newspapers like the New York Times, but what saved the Los Angeles Times is a billionaire coming in and essentially being able to sustain losses, because newspapers used to make a big part of their income on selling classified advertising and other kinds of advertising that now has moved to first to Craigslist and then to Facebook Marketplace and all kinds of other ways.
As you pointed out in the book, excuse a brief interruption, in recent years, more journalists have lost their jobs than coal miners.
Absolutely. And so it's very expensive to produce good investigative journalism. I'm sure you would spend weeks on a story sometimes, and you wouldn't have a byline in the paper every day. I mean, Bush versus Gore notwithstanding, you were doing investigative reporting. And so it's very expensive to do that. The economic model has collapsed. In the meantime, to produce fake news, to produce misinformation or disinformation, very cheap. You can make a website today with not a lot of cost and not a lot of talent that looks aesthetically as good as the website of the Los Angeles Times or the New York Times. And in this marketplace, viewers and readers and listeners have a much harder time figuring out what's true and what's false. And that's especially dangerous, as I'm sure we'll talk about, when it comes to speech about elections being stolen or rigged. Donald Trump, I'll say this and then I can turn to your next question. Donald Trump, in the period between November 3rd, 2020, when the election was held, and 19 days after, so less than 3 weeks, went to Twitter 400 times to inveigh against the election, and many times to claim it was rigged or stolen. Directly, I mean, imagine if we had the polarized politics of today, but the technology of the 1950s. The LA Times would not be printing every day. Donald Trump said it again. He said it was rigged again. It wouldn't be news. It wouldn't get amplified. He can speak directly to his supporters and his detractors and gain a lot of attention. And now we're in a position where I think his speech caused the January 6th insurrection and now has caused millions and millions of his supporters to believe the false claim that the 2020 election was stolen. And how can you have a democracy when millions of people don't believe we had a fair election, whether or not we did?
Yes, well, there is a distinct lack of common ground in the culture now. And I'd like you to step back for just a second to talk about this in the context of the bigger picture. And what I mean by that is you are taking the position. I mean, I've known you for a long time, and you're a sharp analyst. You have a point of view, but you are now sounding the alarm bell. And I do mean an alarm bell. When I read this book and other things you've written recently, basically you are saying that this situation that you're describing of cheap speech, you're saying that it is drowning democracy.
It certainly creates a huge danger. And what we saw in the aftermath of the 2020 election was an attempt to try to turn the loser of the election into the winner by manipulating both public opinion and the rules that Congress uses for figuring out who's gotten the electoral college votes. And in an atmosphere where election officials are intimidated because of threats of violence, and where legislators are pressured by their constituents from below and from Trump from above to change election results. But that is a really dangerous position for our democracy. And this goes a little bit beyond the scope of cheap speech, but I argue in a paper that'll be out next month in the Harvard Law Review Forum that the risk of stolen elections and election subversion in the United States is much higher than it's been at any point in modern history, because of the lack, as you called it, the lack of common ground, the lack of, we can argue about opinions, but we agree on the facts. No, we're not in that world now. I just look at what's happening in Wisconsin. They're still talking about decertifying the election, the presidential election. That's not even a thing. And yet it's being demanded. And every day people are becoming convinced of this falsehood. And then If you believe the last election was stolen, you might be more likely to tolerate what would look like stealing the next one for your side back. And many of the Republican elected and election officials who stood up to Trump in 2020 are going to be gone from office because Trump is out there saying, they didn't back me, kind of loyalty test. They don't back these claims about the 2020 election being stolen, vote them out of office. And so in Georgia, for example, Brad Raffensperger, you may remember the reporting in the Washington Post by Amy Gardner that there were these phone calls between Raffensperger and Trump, where Trump asked Raffensperger to, quote, find me 11,780 votes, enough to swing the election from Biden to Trump. He's being primaried by a member of Congress named Jody Hice, who believes or says he believes the claims of Donald Trump. He's potentially going to be the one that's going to be running elections in 2024. Let's say he runs a fair election. Are Democrats and those on the left going to believe that he's going to run a fair election? What's it going to mean when both sides start to believe that election results are rigged? And so, yes, it's a 5-alarm fire. I don't know how many different ways to say it, but I am extremely concerned about what we're seeing.
One of the things that you were talking about just now, you've introduced, I think, a concept that's very important for all of us to think about in the book, which is something called democracy needs losers' consent. And we now have millions of people who the record shows that their candidate lost, but they are not agreeing to it. I want to turn to another related topic. In traditional free speech cases over many, many years, one of the arguments that people who were advocates of staunch advocates of free speech would say, the problem of erroneous speech or false speech, is that the solution is more speech, not censorship. Okay. And you take the position in this book that is an outmoded idea, and that there's a much greater threat to the country than from anything that censorship would do. At least that's the way I read the book. So I guess I would like you to just expand a little bit about why you think that's a striking position for you to take. I mean, you were many years a staunch traditional free speech advocate, I would say, and now you're really raising serious questions.
First thing I would say is I've always believed that the First Amendment is not absolute, and that reasonable laws, for example, requiring limits on the amount that corporations or foreign entities can spend on our elections is consistent with the First Amendment. Supreme Court agrees with me about foreign entities, disagrees with me about corporations, as in the Citizens United case. So I've always believed there needs to be a balancing of interests. And I also, in this book, don't believe that censorship is the way to deal with most of these problems. The only kind of speech that I would say should be illegal is speech that includes lies about when, where, and how people vote. So, for example, there was a guy in 2016, it was a Trump supporter, who targeted messages at African-American voters, telling them falsely that they could vote by text or by social media hashtag. And about 5,000 people tried to do this. And he's now being prosecuted under a law that may or may not apply. But the Supreme Court, in a 2018 case called Minnesota Voters Alliance versus Mansky, said that such laws are in fact constitutional, just like we have laws against perjury and fraud, right? So it's illegal to lie on the stand under oath. It's illegal to do certain lies that deprive people of their money. So again, the First Amendment is not absolute, but most of the solutions that I advocate are things like improved disclosure laws. And I can talk about those, but let me talk about the general question. Is counter speech enough? And I think whether or not the marketplace of ideas ever accurately represented how society works, it's pretty clear today it doesn't. The idea that truth rises to the top. Anyone who wants to get information, accurate information about whether or not the 2020 election was stolen can find it. This has been the most studied and investigated election in American history. No more attention has been paid in any other election to this one, looking for problems. And I think we can say there is truth, that there is no credible evidence that in any state in the United States, the election results that were reported for president were not accurate, right? And yet that has not risen to the top. Public opinion polls show in many states, many voters, plurality of voters, and I would guess in some states, even a majority of voters believe the false claim that the 2020 election was stolen. And so that is a good indication. It's a good counter argument about counter speech. And so what can you do about it? And the book tries to say, how can we have both protection for robust political debate, which I think is urgent and important, and also fair elections? It's why David Kay and I, our colleague David Kay and I, formed the Fair Elections and Free Speech Center at UCI Law, because we recognize these are both values that are essential to a democracy.
Right, absolutely. And something else that you present in the book, and that I'd like you to talk about, is that it's not just necessarily a political gain for a particular election, but you give some interesting explanations of the economic incentives that there are for people to propagate falsehoods, because it's a way for them to raise money, apparently. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this was one of the most surprising things to me as I began my research for this book. So it certainly seems logical that one reason someone might spread false claims about an election being stolen or other false claims related to politics or elections is because they want political power. That might be what motivates Donald Trump, or it might be his ego because he's trying to claim he wasn't really a loser, right? He was a winner. You remember, Donald Trump also claimed in the 2016 election, falsely claimed, that there was massive voter fraud. About 3 million to 5 million non-citizen votes, all for Hillary Clinton, he said. Not coincidentally the same amount of votes by which Hillary Clinton beat Donald Trump in the popular vote. So there's a political and a personal reason to lie, but there's also a financial incentive. And there was great reporting in the New York Times. And I should say, just kind of, this is a meta comment. I've referred to reporting in the Washington Post and now in the New York Times. We rely on this investigative journalism to find the truth, right? And that's what I'm doing right now. There's reporting in the New York Times last week about InfoWars and Alex Jones, who has spread many false claims, right? He also spread the claims about Sandy Hook. And the reporter was actually writing about Sandy Hook, claiming that massacre of children was a hoax. But a big part of what—
a cruel hoax.
A very cruel hoax.
What Jones did was cruel.
Yes.
So cruel.
And Jones spent a good part of 2020 and 2021 making false claims of voter fraud. And according to the reporting, he was bringing in $55 million a month for sales of vitamins and body armor and like all around the world. People are producing false speech related to elections and selling it to Americans, right? So they're producing fake YouTube videos, and those YouTube videos produce profits because you can run ads on those and the creators get royalties off of that. Many of the people who have been supporting the false claim that the 2020 election was stolen have been able to do so for profit. And what that does is, and this is the other thing that I think surprised me in my research about the social science, is that many of these false claims actually cause people to want more of it, right? So it creates its own demand. It's not as though people can't get true information if they want it. Some people, and I think this requires a kind of sociological explanation about the changing nature of politics and culture in the United States. Some people want false information being fed to them because it helps to explain why maybe their economic or cultural positions have changed in the United States. And Donald Trump really tapped into that demand. And the more that you get that false information, the more you want something that's going to further confirm your beliefs. And although it's beyond the scope of the book, I think that same kind of explanation goes a long way towards our understanding of why it is that so many people believe the false claims that the COVID vaccines don't work, and why people are literally losing their lives not getting vaccinated when the available science indicates that while not risk-free, these vaccines overall very much lower your risk of being of dying from COVID-related illness.
And regrettably, this phenomenon is not not limited to our country. Right now, in real time, we all seem to be, reading about and hearing about sort of manufactured reality in Russia. And there's been some fascinating stories about people, in Ukraine, calling, people in Russia who are their relatives or something and telling them what's going on. And the responses are, well, that's not happening. That's not what we're hearing here. I mean, it's quite stunning. You have fake news and a news blackout.
I do think that, let me make two observations about that. One is that in some ways, this illustrates the bright side that Professor Volokh was talking about in his 1995 article, because it's become increasingly difficult, given our technology, to really hide the truth. And so one of the ways that information is getting into Russia right now is people are posting information in Google Maps, because that was one place where the Russian censors had not been looking. And so there is this way around it. But I do think you see, this has become clear in the fighting over the Ukraine, which obviously is not covered in my book, which was finished many months ago. But I do talk about this phenomenon in the book that Professors Citron and Chesney called the liar's dividend. And the idea is that when there's so much false information out there, even when something is true, someone who is maybe embarrassed by or who could be hurt by true damaging information can claim that it's false. And so we see this with Russia now, labeling true stories as fake news and doing fact checks of, like the maternity ward that had been targeted in Ukraine. We also saw this, to take it back to the United States, Roger Stone. There's a documentary about Roger Stone that was written up in the Washington Post. I don't think the documentary is out yet, but it shows Roger Stone seeming to be involved in activities related to the January 6th insurrection. And Roger Stone's response is, oh, those are all deep fakes. That's all fake news. So this is what Chesney and Citron call the liar's dividend, that one of the benefits of an information environment where there's so much false speech is that the liar can claim that even the true speech is false. And then voters just throw up their hands and don't believe that there's any way to determine what's true and false. And so this is another problem, right? So it's not just about another problem for elections. It's not just about a subset of voters believing the election was stolen. It's also that voters are being deprived of information they need to make intelligent voting decisions, decide who to vote for consistent with their interests and their values. You need to have accurate information about what people think and what's happening in the world. And the less accurate that information is, the harder it is for voters to make competent decisions. That's why, for example, when it comes to deep fakes, that is, using artificial intelligence to alter a video or an audio to make, say, a politician appear to do something like, say, a racial epithet, or be in a sexually compromised position, or be shown having some kind of health crisis. I would like a law that would require social media companies that post videos to label all deep fakes as altered. That would apply whether it's satire or whether it's serious or whatever it is. That kind of law, I think, helps with the problem that counter speech doesn't always work. It gives a little push on the side. It's not censorship. It doesn't say you can't show the video, but it does give voters in real time the ability to maybe question whether they should believe what they see and what they hear.
Well, picking up from that, it seems like it would be good for you to talk a little bit about the role of, you talked earlier about how, the contemporary situation, intermediaries have a lesser role, but now we seem to have some, in a sort of de facto sense, some intermediaries like Facebook, Twitter, and other things. And I would say in general that the record, it's pretty clear that they have not been very vigilant about, I guess what I'd say, policing deep fakes at all. So what is there to do? Is there something that can be done about that?
So that's an interesting question. What should these companies do? So let me start by saying that I don't believe that outside of the very narrow ban on lying about when, where, or how people vote, I don't believe that we should have laws that, and the foreign spending ban, I don't believe we should have laws that say it's illegal to post certain content on social media. And I also don't believe in laws that require even-handedness on social media sites. And so it's not just someone like our friend and former UCI law dean, Erwin Chemerinsky, who believes that we should have something like the fairness doctrine applied to social media, that would require you to fairly present both sides. It's Justice Clarence Thomas of the United States Supreme Court. And this is astonishing. Justice Thomas has been, when it comes to the First Amendment, very much a libertarian when it comes to political speech issues ordinarily. So he doesn't believe in the fairness doctrine. He doesn't believe that corporations can be limited in their spending on elections. And yet Justice Thomas went out of his way in an opinion about a year and a half ago in a case called Biden versus Knight First Amendment Institute. It was a case involving whether Donald Trump could block followers on Twitter, and the Supreme Court dismissed it as moot. But Justice Thomas, concurring in that, said, let me talk about something else. He uses an occasion, and what he said is he believed in the constitutionality of laws like Florida's, which would require social media companies to carry the speech of politicians, even politicians that they don't want to carry, even politicians that might call for violence, or politicians that might falsely claim the election is stolen. This is obviously a law that was passed to deal with the fact that Twitter and Facebook deplatformed Donald Trump, took him off their platforms after January 6th, 2021, when we had the insurrection. I think that kind of law is delving into the private choices of private companies that have First Amendment rights. Just like Fox News or The Atlantic or the LA Times has the right to decide what to publish, doesn't have to give equal time or file a reply. We have a famous Supreme Court case called Tornillo about another Florida law that said that you can't require a newspaper to give a right to reply to someone who's criticized in the newspaper. So I don't think that we want to deal with it that way, because I don't trust a government bureaucrat. Just imagine the president you hate the most getting to appoint the bureaucrat that decides whether something is fair or even-handed. I think that's really problematic. Or imagine the law that requires the social media company to carry speech of a candidate that advocates violence. That seems like a terrible idea. And so what should we do about these social media companies? Well, when it comes to this issue about deplatforming, I think the choice to deplatform Donald Trump was the right one, but it was made too late. At first, what these companies tried to do was to label Trump's speech when he would write about elections. And the labels were not very useful to voters. In fact, there's some evidence that I cite in the book that the labels actually made these more salient and might have convinced more voters that his false claims were true. But what about this deplatforming position? I think that it's up to us as the public to pressure these social media companies. These social media companies, although they don't call themselves publishers under Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996, they actually are de facto publishers in the sense that they decide what content to include and exclude. If they didn't do that and you turned on Facebook, you would be flooded with pornography, hate speech, all kinds of things that you wouldn't want, right? They promote content, they demote content, they produce a product. And if they don't want to be associated with Donald Trump calling for the election to be stolen, that's good. Let them make that choice. If they want to include him, let them include him. But the public should pressure. And if these companies are so big, and I talk about this in the book, that the companies cannot be pressured, and I think here of something like Google search, then the solution is not a speech limitation, but antitrust to make these companies less dominant. And I think that is a non-speech related way to assure that we're not going to have a well-functioning marketplace of ideas, but it will perhaps be a little less dysfunctional.
Well, two follow-up questions to that. That is, one, can you say anything about the status of any potentially pending antitrust litigation, and whether or not any of it could get passed given the current climate in Congress? And the other thing is, I know that you sort of walked up to the line about something, and you're clearly not in favor of censorship, but I think it would also be useful for you to talk a bit about something related to the standards for deplatforming someone, particularly when the person is advocating violence.
Yeah, so I'm not an antitrust expert. I wish we had Professor Leslie, our colleague, on this Zoom to be able to talk about that. I do know those cases are going forward, but that the standards are quite difficult. There are cases against Google. I don't think it's fair to, necessarily call Facebook a monopoly, but certainly there are network effects, right? So if you go join a different social network, you're not going to have all your friends on there. This is one of the reasons why Trump is trying to start this alternative platform called Truth Social, Truth like Pravda. Very interesting choice of a name, and they're having some technical difficulties getting it started. But aside from that, some of the anecdotal reporting, at least at the beginning now, it's only been open for I think about a month, is that there's not that much going on there because when you can't interact with people with different points of view, it's less fun, and you can't own the libs if the libs are not there to play. So it seems like it's a bunch of Trump supporters and journalists who are watching each other to see if anything interesting happens there. So because there are these network effects of companies like Facebook, they do have some market power, and I do think that has to be closely looked at. Remember, Facebook, now called Meta, the company called Meta, not only owns the Facebook platform, but they also own Instagram, they also own WhatsApp, and they have lots of ability to collect data on you. And I talk about that too in the book. That's kind of a separate discussion about campaign-related advertising that piggybacks on this huge data that's collected and maybe can be used for manipulating public opinion. And so that's another question about whether that data can be limited in terms of its political use. In terms of your other question about what the standards should be, Professor David Kaye of the UCI Fair Elections Free Speech Center and I, along with some other scholars, wrote a letter when the Facebook Oversight Board, which is a kind of self-created, like a Supreme Court for Facebook, except it's not binding on Facebook. They were asked to address the question of whether the deplatforming was correct. And we wrote a letter and we said that should be a last resort. In a democracy, even if people have odious ideas, they should be able to share them. Politicians should be able to make their points. There is this danger of government censorship. So we say it should be a very high bar for the platforms in their private capacity when they're deciding whether or not to deplatform someone. And we say only when they consistently denigrate the integrity of an election process without justification, or they call for violent overthrow of a democratic government. Only in those kinds of circumstances is deplatforming justified. So very high bar. Trump easily exceeded the bar based on what he had done. But it should be very, very difficult to deplatform because we really do want to have the ability of voters to hear different points of view and make their own decisions. So deplatforming is a very powerful tool. And again, let me be clear, because as soon as my book came out, there were stories on Fox News and Daily Mail saying, University of California professor calls for censorship. Aside from the very small area of when, where, how people vote, something the Supreme Court has said can be constitutionally limited on the First Amendment, and foreign speech about elections, which the Supreme Court has said can be limited. I'm not calling for censorship. I'm not calling for the government. And by censorship, and I should be clear about this, I mean a government law that says you're not allowed to say something or you could face punishment. Private companies, when they decide to exclude Donald Trump, that is, in my view, not censorship. That is a private decision, just like the LA Times decides we're not going to print all 400 times when Donald Trump falsely claims the election is stolen. We might have one or two stories about that.
In the past, in this country, there have been moments when the public rose up about a particular issue, be it civil rights, Vietnam, anti-apartheid movement. And you, just a moment ago, you were talking about the public, we the public, putting pressure on companies to do better than what they're doing. And I was wondering if you could say if you think that there are some specific, are people formulating sets of of arguments of what to do, and what kind of a prospect do you think do you see for for public, for people rising up and forming an organization or something like that to put pressure on people? Do you think that that's a viable possibility?
Right. So one thing, because this book focuses on the dark side of cheap speech, we shouldn't ignore the bright side, right? So the dark side is that not only could Donald Trump make his false claims repeatedly that the 2020 election was stolen, and remember that famous tweet or set of tweets, I have one of them in the book, Cheap Speech, come to Washington, D.C., it'll be wild, we'll have a wild time, and encourage people. And then they met on Facebook groups, many of these people, the so-called Stop the Steal movement. Facebook was trying to shut them down. They couldn't get them shut down fast enough. And people were organizing, and we're learning now still about how the January 6th insurrection took place, which I think was extremely dangerous. And some people are poo-pooing it. It wasn't an insurrection. It was not a big deal. It was peaceful protesters. No, in fact, if we were just a little less lucky, we could have had the leadership of Congress killed. The vice president could have been killed. Would have been terrible. Trump might have said, declared martial law. I mean, it really could have been the end of American democracy, that moment, right? So there's a really big dark side, and I focus on that. But there's also a bright side. So you think about the racial justice movement, the George Floyd movement, and how people were able to organize that way, sharing police videos of police, whether it's George Floyd or something else. When people can see that directly, that is very powerful. And then those same tools which were used to organize against democracy can be used to organize in favor of democracy. And I had a piece related to the book that came out in the Washington Post last week because about this Facebook decision to deplatform Donald Trump. After the oversight board sent it back to Facebook to both come up with a standard and say how long the penalty would last, Facebook said 2 years, and then we'll revisit. And so on January 7th, 2023, Donald Trump is eligible to be back on Facebook. So let's say that happens. I urge them not to make that choice because I think he continues. And we know because his spokesperson, Liz Harrington, posts on Twitter Donald Trump statements about the election being stolen and calling it the biggest fraud in American history or whatever he's saying. I think if Donald Trump is restored to Facebook, there's going to be a huge movement to have people leave Facebook. And I think it's going to become much more of a political liability for Facebook. At least I hope that it will. And this, it's going to be very hard on Facebook. Imagine Donald Trump is the 2024 Republican nominee for president. Is he not going to have access to that platform? People are going to say he should. But I say so long as he's still undermining confidence in the election and potentially there to call for violence if things don't go his way, then he should be removed. But there's going to be an outcry either way. And if Democrats lose control of one or both houses of Congress after the 2022 elections, and the heads of Mark Zuckerberg and the other heads of Meta decide we want to curry favor with Republicans, you could easily see Donald Trump being restored to Facebook and continuing to spew this knowledge. And let me make one more point before you get to your question. Some people think it's actually been to Donald Trump's benefit that he has been off Twitter and Facebook because you don't have that incendiary stuff in your face. That's possible, but I do think that the risk to our democracy is so great from the ability to create these kind of waves of beliefs about the election being stolen, that is the biggest danger that we face to our democracy today.
Well, I'm certainly glad that you reminded all us of the courageous young woman who photographed George Floyd's murder. And of course, anyone who's lived in this area, I think, remembers George Holliday taking the Rodney King, and there's beating photos, which had a big impact. And you're right, and there happened in a number of other cases where people who would have normally not gotten credence for their claims about police brutality, police violence, there was photographic evidence. I mean, I think certainly a bright side of the current world is what I call citizen videographers, like the young woman in Minneapolis, very, very, very courageous, and so on. So Rick, you're a lawyer, you're a law professor, and but in this book, I'd say you'd say that there are some significant limits to what the law can do in this area, right?
Not only limits on what, say, the Supreme Court would allow, and I think that so things like improved disclosure, I think should be considered constitutional under the First Amendment. Things like labeling deepfakes as altered should be constitutional under the First Amendment. I'm not convinced that the Supreme Court would agree. The very conservative Supreme Court today. I also think the very conservative Supreme Court today might uphold a Florida law that would require the carrying of politicians, even those that might advocate violence. So there's somewhat of a problem with what the court would do. But I think that if we're going to have a functioning democracy, we do need strong protection for speech. And so I don't favor laws that would impose broad censorship. And so then what can you do? And here I think we have to turn, this is what the last part of cheap speech talks about, to private actions. And I've already mentioned one, which is pressure on the platforms. The platform, and that pressure, I should say, should come not just from the public, but should also come from the employees at these companies who have a tremendous amount of power. We've seen this at Facebook and at other companies. Just now, we see Disney employees staging a walkout because Disney has not come out forcefully enough against the so-called Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. So employee action can make a big difference as well. But so that's just one set of pressure on the platforms is one thing. Another one that I think is really important is giving, not by law, but through private action, giving voters better tools to be able to find truthful information. So another example I offer in the book is the idea of accreditation by journalistic societies. So you can imagine a society of journalists saying, here are the 5 things you need to do to be considered someone practicing objective journalism. You have to have 2 sources. You have to give the other side a right to respond. You have to print that response, whatever those are. And I'll leave that to you and to the other journalists. And that when someone pledges to do this and actually does it, they would get a privately determined seal of approval. Right. And then that seal of approval can be picked up by the social media companies. Like, this is real news. And, you can imagine Breitbart, the pro-Trump website, going and trying to get the accreditation, and it could be a public fight about it. And that itself, I think, would be very edifying as to, who follows these standards and what do they mean. But that would provide a signal for voters. So when you see something, it says the Daily News, the Daily News of Irvine. Well, what is that, right? Is that a real thing or a fake thing? Well, this would help voters to be able to determine. So I think we need some of that. I also favor the model of nonprofit journalism that we've seen at places like the Nevada Independent and the Texas Tribune. They're doing really high quality investigative journalism, and they're doing it with a donor model because the economic model for for-profit newspapers, as more newspapers get gobbled up by hedge funds or decimated by budget cuts and staffing cuts, it's become harder and harder. So we need to figure out how to subsidize privately, I think, investigative journalism, especially on the local level, because that's where most of their day-to-day life experience is coming from, decisions made on the local level. And voters tend to trust local news more than national news. So I think we need that.
That's where staffing has been shredded the most.
Absolutely.
The New York Times, for example, now has a much bigger staff than it ever had, just because they've got a very successful web operation. And clearly there are other nonprofits on a national level, like, the Marshall Project.
And ProPublica is another one. Yes.
That are doing very good work. Before we turn to questions, I want to just briefly get you to talk about the very last part of the book, where basically you get the role of the public in dealing with this problem because of limitations of other things. And
so I do think this is the hardest problem, is how do we instill respect for the rule of law and respect for the scientific process, right? Scientists are not infallible. None of us are infallible, right? So we were told conflicting information early on in the pandemic about wearing masks, not wearing masks. It took a while to figure things out. But belief in the scientific method and the scientific process and following the science to where it goes, that kind of respect for institutions that try to produce truth. I mean, think about Donald Trump attacked the opposition party, his own party, the FBI, the press as the enemy of the people, right? All the institutions in society that help people determine what's true and what's not true. We need to kind of bolster each other. That's why I think it's so important when you see, for example, bar associations, right? Private bar associations going after those attorneys who lied about the election being stolen, right? So we can police ourselves and hold us up to a higher standard. So Rudy Giuliani has at least temporarily lost his law license. John Eastman is being investigated by the California bar, whether he should lose his law license. I mean, these are difficult questions, right? And when do you cross the line from zealous advocacy for your client to not acting as a lawyer or making false statements in court? Or, where is that line, and how do we know when it's proven? But bar associations, the press, civic organizations, corporations, labor unions, religious organizations, we all need to come together. It's an all hands on deck moment where, respect for fair elections, free speech, and the rule of law is what's on the line.
Okay, well, I'm gonna go into the Q&A box and say, so the first question is, how to heal the divide in this country when Democrats constantly demonize all Republicans because of a few extreme right crazy folks? Isn't that deepening the divide?
I do think that it's important not to paint with not to paint a caricature of what's going on. And I've been very clear, both in praising those Republicans like Brad Raffensperger, who stood up to Donald Trump and assured that we had a fair election count in 2020, as well as criticizing some who've made false claims of stolen elections on the left. It is important to not demonize, but it's also true that you need to call it as it is. And the fact is, and I document this in the book, that false claims about stolen elections have resonated much more on the right than the left. And building on earlier work, misinformation has spread more on the American right than the American left. It may not always be this way, and it's not inevitable that it will stay this way. But that is the situation we have today. And so when I call for an all hands on deck moment, I'm calling for responsible Democrats and Republicans and independents and others to come together and say, we may not agree on a lot of things. We may not agree about immigration or abortion or taxes, but we can agree that we should have a fair election where people get to, everyone's eligible to vote, and only eligible voters get to cast a ballot that should be fairly and accurately counted. And that the loser should accept the results of the election as legitimate once all questions about its legitimacy have been fairly investigated. I mean, that's a very low bar for a democracy. And I think that it's something that everyone should get behind. And yet even raising this issue is seen as somehow taking a partisan stand. Even fact checking is seen as taking a partisan stand. So when PolitiFact comes out and says this claim about the election is being stolen is false, they're accused of being part of the mainstream media that is distorting the truth. And so it's very hard in this environment because it is a subset of the Republican Party and not even necessarily members of the party. And sometimes people say, well, what do conservatives think? And I say, this is not conservatives. These are people who are more part of a cult of personality that's about a particular individual, not about conservative values. There's some very strong conservatives. Think of Liz Cheney, not someone I ever would have thought of as a hero. Because my politics are very different than hers. But she, in fact, has been a hero on the issue of election integrity.
Next question is, what do you think election officials who are all over the country can do to build more confidence in elections results?
That's a great question. And back just before the pandemic began in the United States, I had a conference at UCI called Can American Democracy Survive the 2020 Elections? Because I was obviously very concerned about this before we even had the 2020 elections. And we talked about what different groups could do, what journalists could do, what media could do. And one of the things that we talked about election officials doing is providing transparency about their processes and accurate information. So there's some very easy steps that local election officials should do. They should apply to social media companies for verified status, and they should make sure that their websites are .gov for their web addresses. These are ways that, just like that idea I talked about the seal of approval from journalists. These are ways that election officials can assure that they can get out their message. And so people are not taken in by false statements about how elections are run. There needs to be protection for voters to make sure that voters are not intimidated. There need to be fair processes. There needs to be an ability to explain what's going on How many votes are left to be counted? When will they be counted? Can there be observers who watch the process? But it has to be done in a way so that these observers don't actually interfere with the fair processes and cannot intimidate. So we need all of those things. And one of the things I hope that's going to come out of the current negotiations among Democratic and Republican senators about potentially changing things like the Electoral Count Act, the rules by which Congress certifies the results of the presidential election, there may be some protection for election officials. Because one thing we know is that 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 election officials are talking about leaving office before 2024, many because they're fed up with dealing with all of these false claims. And so stick with it, please, and hopefully Congress will provide some protection for these heroic election officials.
One member of the audience brought up that point in the context of saying that, there are a number of these people have gotten threatened, election officials and over the past 2 years, health officials. And this member of the audience says that the police agencies have not responded very forcefully to these things, often saying that they're like free speech issues.
Right. There was some great reporting. Again, I'm pointing to important investigative journalism by Reuters. And Reuters went and sometimes they'd find an election official who was threatened with violence, and they would go and ask the police, well, why didn't you investigate this? Oh, we couldn't figure out who the person was. And then Reuters in 15 minutes was able to figure out who the person was. There's been a lack of seriousness. I think after the 2020 election and through the Trump years, which was, there was so much news and people were so on edge, there's been a lot of withdrawal from public space. We've had the pandemic. It's just been a very emotionally difficult time for many Americans, understandably so. And one reaction to that is withdrawal from the news. I mean, this is why newspaper subscriptions are down, cable television news watching is down, because people are burned out. And I think this is also true about police departments, and they also don't want to get themselves involved in potentially politically difficult issues. So it's urgent. We need to protect our voters. We need to protect our poll workers. We need to protect our election officials, because again, you can't have a functioning democracy unless people can freely and fairly vote in a system that is transparent and that is fair. And that's what we need to aim towards.
And also there's this long-term disincentive to take some of those jobs, because people who man the polls, I mean, it's not like it was in the old day. I mean, it's not like they're threatened, and for basically for getting no money,
for giving up a 13-hour day, right? Yeah. And then they get harassed. Yes, it's a terrible situation. And the book is dedicated both to the law enforcement officers who gave their health and in some cases their lives to protect the Capitol, and to those election workers, poll workers, and election officials who assured that we had a fair and safe election in 2020, because it took a Herculean effort. Remember, we voted in the middle of a pandemic. It was just amazing to me that we had such a successful election. And then the reward for that is not only no pat on the back, but threats of violence. And some of these threats are really scary, and no one should be subject to it, much less those who are standing up for our democracy.
One member of the audience asked about, galvanizing more people to, be poll workers and poll watchers, in the next, even in this year's election and in 2024. On a practical level, are there things that states and localities could do to pass measures that would, create bigger budgets for these things, so that to make these systems not only work more efficiently, but to have, greater protection for the people, and have a budget so you could have a bigger staff, people would have more protection?
Oh, yes. And this is a huge issue because in the 2020 election, I write about this a little bit in Cheap Speech. Because of the pandemic, the costs associated with running our elections went way up. Many more absentee ballots had to be printed and mailed. You had to pay for, all of the sanitizing of equipment, and dealing with longer lines and all of this. And there wasn't enough money to pay for all of it. And so private foundations ended up supplying a lot of money that was used to run our elections. And a lot of that money came from the Mark Zuckerberg Chan Foundation through a foundation in Illinois. And now this is being seen as evidence of corruption because more Democratic majority election jurisdictions took the money than those that were Republicans, even though the money was offered to everyone. And this is part of these false claims that are being made now in Wisconsin that this was somehow bribery or illegal. I think the easy, and so some places are passing laws saying no private money in elections. Well, that's fine in the future, even though I don't think there was anything untoward. It was actually heroic to give this money so we could have a fair election in 2020. But fine if you don't want private money, but you need to adequately fund elections. Elections are consistently underfunded. Machinery breaks down. It costs a lot of money. Besides, going to war, what it takes to gear up the government and society to run elections is one of the biggest things we do as a country every 4 years or every 2 years, if you count the congressional elections. It needs to be adequately funded. And we need not only to have protection for these workers, but incentives so that people will stay in these jobs.
So we have time, I think, for one more question, and then I'll let you do some summing up. One member of the audience notes that for many years, I mean, at least going back to the late 70s, maybe, that there's been a lot of right-wing talk radio. And this listener, this member of the audience asks, why is there no left-wing talk radio in this country?
Well, I think that people communicate in different ways, and it's not as though Rachel Maddow, who's kind of the equivalent of left-wing talk radio, is, she's quite popular. Yes. I don't think there's any problem with people getting different points of view, but to the extent that some of this right-wing talk radio is parroting false claims about the election being stolen or other kinds of false claims, I think that goes back to the point about the appetite for misinformation and disinformation. And there isn't that same appetite because we don't have a symmetry of demand for disinformation right now in our current moment. One
of the other member of the audience just immediately chimed in after he said that KPFK, which is a longtime Pacifica station based here, has provided a lot of great information, and that is certainly true. And there are some other programs, but I think in the aggregate, there's, at least on the radio, there's much more on the right than there is from the left. Not that there's nothing from the left, but there is a lot more from the right on the radio. So you've got time for maybe a minute or two if you'd like to make some sum up comments. And
let me just pivot off of that and say that I wouldn't think that the main problem we have on the left or the right is a lack of access to information. You have access to more information than you could ever consume. And so then the question is, how do you help people make good choices? And by good choices, I mean choices that lead people to get accurate information to help them make good decisions as voters, not to be swayed one way or the other, but to know which politicians and which ballot measures, if we're talking about California, are consistent with my values and my interests. I want competent voters. And there are lots of laws and lots of policies that we could adopt that would make us have more competent voters. And on the specific question of election integrity, there's a lot of work to be done to assure that we restore losers' consent so that people feel like we can hold an election, my side might win, my side might lose, but it's not an election where if my side loses, it's because the election was stolen. When we're at that stage, our very democracy is in danger. And what I'm trying to do in Cheap Speech is to give us tools so that we can step back from that moment and have a democracy where we can disagree about opinions, but agree on the basic facts about how our elections are run.
I think that's terrific. I would just like, on a personal level, just make a pitch to members of the audience. Read quality newspapers, and one thing that you can all do is subscribe and donate to a public radio station. They're all over, in Southern California, there are several: KPFK, KPPC, KCRW. They all provide vital service. They give you reliable information most of the time. And the fact is that they rely on the public for their existence and their ability to do deep reporting. So I think I subscribe to 3 or 4 of them, and I urge everyone to do that. And thank you all for listening. Have a good evening.
Thanks, everybody. And thank you, Henry.